Robert, 78 years old, moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who carried more than just age in his bones. His hands, weathered and scarred, trembled slightly as he pulled on a faded flannel shirt, the same one he wore every June 17th. A small tattoo peeked out from under the rolled-up sleeve, a Marine Corps emblem, its edges blurred by time but still sharp in meaning. He shuffled to the kitchen, where the linoleum curled at the edges and the fridge hummed like an old friend. On the counter sat a box of cake mix, a bottle of cheap bourbon, and two plastic cups, the kind you'd find at a gas station. Next to them, carefully placed, were a dog-eared photograph and a single dog tag, its metal dulled but the name etched clear: Mitchell, David R. He mixed the batter by hand, the rhythm of the spoon against the bowl steady, almost meditative. The oven ticked as it preheated, filling the small space with warmth. Robert's eyes drifted to the photograph, a snapshot from 1969, somewhere in Quang Tri. Four young Marines grinning despite the mud and sweat, their rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. David was second from the left, his smile wide, his eyes bright with the kind of hope only youth could muster in a place like that. Robert's own face, barely recognizable now, stared back from the right. He hadn't looked at himself in that photo for years. It was David he saw. Always David. As the cake baked, filling the apartment with the sweet scent of vanilla, Robert sat at the table, the dog tag in his hand. He ran his thumb over the raised letters, his mind slipping back to a promise made in the heat of a jungle night, under a sky torn by tracer fire. "If I don't make it, Rob," David had said, his voice low but steady, "don't let my birthday go uncelebrated. Promise me you'll raise a glass, eat some cake. Don't forget me." Robert had laughed then, a nervous bark, and clapped David on the shoulder. "You're not going anywhere, Mitch. But yeah, I promise." The memory tightened his chest, and he set the tag down, careful, like it might break. The timer dinged, pulling him back. He pulled the cake from the oven, a lopsided thing, but good enough. He frosted it with a thin layer of chocolate, the kind David used to swipe with his finger when they'd get care packages from home. Robert placed the cake in a tin, gathered the bourbon, the cups, the photo, and the dog tag, and headed out. His old Ford pickup groaned as he turned the key, the engine coughing before it settled into a familiar rumble. The town of Willow Creek was waking up as he drove through, its streets lined with brick storefronts and American flags that fluttered in the early breeze. At the gas station, he stopped to fill up, the cake tin balanced on the passenger seat. The cashier, a young woman with pink-streaked hair and a bored expression, glanced at it as she rang him up. "Got a party today?" she asked, popping her gum. Robert's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Day of an old friend's birthday." She nodded, already looking past him to the next customer. Robert didn't mind. He wasn't one for small talk anymore. He climbed back into the truck, the radio playing a soft country tune, and drove on. The cemetery was on the edge of town, tucked behind a grove of oaks that whispered in the wind. Robert parked near the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped out. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the rows of headstones. He carried the tin, the bourbon, and the small bundle of items in his arms, his steps slow but purposeful. He knew the path by heart, past the marble angel, left at the flagpole, straight until the small, unassuming stone came into view. David R. Mitchell, L. Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps, 1946 to 1969. Robert eased himself onto the grass, his knees protesting but his resolve firm. He set the cake tin down, opened it, and placed a single candle in the center. With a flick of his old Zippo, the flame caught, flickering in the breeze. He poured bourbon into the two plastic cups, one for him, one for David, and set David's beside the headstone. The photograph went next, propped against the stone, the young faces staring out at a world that had moved on without them. The dog tag he kept in his hand, its weight grounding him. "Hey, Mitch," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Another year, huh? You'd be 79 today. Probably still giving me hell for my cooking." He chuckled, but the sound faded quickly. He looked at the headstone, the letters worn but clear, and let the silence settle. Then he started talking, the words spilling out like they did every year. He told David about the past 12 months. The arthritis that had gotten worse, the new diner that opened downtown, the way the town still put up flags on Veterans Day, but seemed to forget what they meant. He talked about the nightmares that hadn't stopped, the ones where he saw David's face, bloodied and still, under the jungle canopy. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. Quang Tri, late 1969. They'd been on patrol, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of mosquitoes. David was point, as always, his stride confident even in the mud. Robert was behind him, grumbling about the heat, when the world exploded. A tripwire, a mine, too fast to know. David had turned, his eyes wide, and shoved Robert back just as the blast tore through. The sound was deafening, the air filled with dirt and screams. Robert had crawled to him, hands shaking, calling his name, but David was gone, his body limp, his blood soaking into the earth. "You idiot," Robert had whispered then, over and over, as if it could bring him back. "Why'd you do it?" He blinked, back in the present, the bourbon cup trembling in his hand. "I should have been first," he said to the headstone, his voice breaking. "You had a girl waiting, a family. I had nothing. Why'd you push me out of the way?" He swiped at his eyes, angry at the tears, but they came anyway. He let them fall, silent, his shoulders shaking as the grief he'd carried for decades spilled over. The wind picked up, rustling the oaks, and the candle flickered out. Robert stared at it, then leaned forward to relight it, his hands steadier now. He poured more bourbon into both cups, raised his in a toast. "To you, Mitch." "Happy birthday." He didn't drink, just set the cup beside David's, the amber liquid catching the light. He cut the cake, leaving half on a paper plate next to the headstone, the photo, and the dog tag. "I kept my promise," he said softly, "like every year." He sat for a while longer, the silence of the cemetery wrapping around him like a blanket. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed from somewhere beyond the trees. Finally, Robert stood, his knees creaking, and brushed the grass from his jeans. He left the cake, the photo, and the dog tag where they were, a small offering to a man who'd given everything. He walked back to his truck, not looking back, the weight of the morning settling into his bones. The town was busier now, the streets filled with people going about their day. Robert drove slowly, the radio off, his thoughts still at the cemetery. He didn't notice the young man watching him from the sidewalk, a kid in his early 20s with a buzz cut and a Marine Corps cap tucked under his arm. The kid, a reservist named Ethan Carter, had seen Robert at the cemetery before, always on the same day, always with the same quiet ritual. Ethan had never spoken to him, but something about the old man's solitude stuck with him. Robert pulled into the parking lot of the VFW Hall, where a small Veterans Day event was being set up. He hadn't planned to stop, but the sight of the flags and the sound of a bugle practicing taps drew him in. He parked and stepped out, his flannel shirt slightly rumpled, the tattoo on his arm barely visible. The hall was bustling, veterans in old uniforms, families setting up tables, a few local politicians shaking hands. Robert kept to the edge, his hands in his pockets, watching. A young volunteer, clipboard in hand, approached him. "Sir, this event's for registered attendees," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Do you have an invitation?" Robert blinked, caught off guard. "No, I just saw the flags. Thought I'd stop by." Her smile tightened. "I'm sorry, but we're at capacity. You can check with the office next week for future events." He nodded, already turning away. "That's fine," he said, his voice low. He felt the familiar sting of being unseen, a ghost in a world that had moved on. He started back toward his truck, but Ethan, who'd been watching from across the lot, stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ethan called, jogging over. He was tall, his posture straight from years of drill, his eyes sharp with purpose. "This man's a veteran. He belongs here." The volunteer hesitated, glancing at Robert's worn clothes, his unassuming stance. "I understand, but we have rules." "Rules?" Ethan's voice was calm, but carried an edge. He looked at Robert, then back at her. "This man's got a Marine Corps tattoo older than both of us. I've seen him at the cemetery every year, honoring someone who didn't come home." "You're telling me he doesn't belong?" The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of others nearby. Robert shifted, uncomfortable with the attention, but Ethan wasn't done. He turned to the small crowd, his voice rising. This is Robert Hayes. I don't know his whole story, but I know he's been coming to that cemetery every June 17th for years, with a cake and a bottle of bourbon, to keep a promise to a fallen Marine. If that doesn't earn him a place here, what does? Heads turned. A few older veterans nodded, their eyes narrowing as they studied Robert. A man in a crisp dress uniform, Colonel James, a retired officer who organized the event, stepped forward. He looked at Robert, his gaze lingering on the tattoo, the quiet strength in the old man's stance. "Mr. Hayes," the colonel said, his voice steady, "would you do us the honor of joining us today?" Robert opened his mouth, then closed it, his throat tight. He nodded once, a small gesture, but his eyes shone with something unspoken. The crowd parted as he walked toward the hall, Ethan at his side. The volunteer flustered, mumbled an apology, but Robert just gave her a small smile. "It's all right," he said. "Mistakes happen." Inside, the hall smelled of coffee and polished wood, the walls lined with photos of local veterans, some from wars long forgotten by most. The colonel led Robert to a table near the front, where a group of younger Marines sat, their uniforms crisp, their eyes curious. Ethan stayed close, pulling out a chair for Robert. "Tell us about him," Ethan said quietly as the room settled. "The man you visit every year." Robert hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. A letter, yellowed and worn, dated 1969. He unfolded it carefully, his hands steady now, and began to read. The VFW hall was warm, the air thick with the scent of brewed coffee, and the faint tang of polished brass from the plaques lining the walls. The murmur of voices quieted as Robert Hayes unfolded the letter, its edges frayed, the ink faded but legible. His hands, steady now, held it like a relic, something sacred that had survived decades of dust and doubt. The young Marines at the table leaned in, their faces a mix of curiosity and respect. Ethan Carter, the reservist who'd spoken up for Robert, sat beside him, his Marine Corps cap resting on the table, a silent signal of solidarity. Colonel James stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Robert with a quiet intensity. Robert cleared his throat, his voice low at first, almost lost in the hum of the room. "This is from David," he said, glancing at the letter. "Wrote it a week before he didn't come back." He paused, his thumb brushing over the paper, as if he could still feel the jungle heat trapped in its creases. "He was my best friend. My brother, really. We went through Paris Island together, shipped out to Vietnam in '68. He was the kind of guy who'd give you his last cigarette, his last sip of water, even when he needed it more." The room was silent now, the clink of coffee cups and the rustle of papers gone. Robert's gaze stayed on the letter, but his mind was elsewhere, back in the mud and sweat of Quang Tri, where the air smelled of gunpowder and fear, where David's laugh could cut through the tension like a blade. "He wrote this to his sister," Robert continued, his voice steadier now. "Told her about the guys in our platoon, about the food we'd dream up when the sea rations got old. Said he missed her apple pie, the way the porch swing creaked back home. But the last part," he faltered, his jaw tightening. "The last part was for me." He began to read, his voice rough but clear. "Rob, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to give you hell for stealing my socks. Keep your head down, brother. And don't forget my birthday, cake and bourbon like we said. Tell Sarah I love her, and don't let the world forget us." Robert folded the letter, his fingers lingering on the creases. "Sarah was his sister. She passed a few years back. But I've kept the promise. Every June 17th, I bring the cake, the bourbon. I sit with him." He looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's, then sweeping across the room. "I don't talk about it much. Didn't think anyone would care." The silence held for a moment, heavy with the weight of his words. Then Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "We care, sir. I've seen you out there at the cemetery. I didn't know the story, but I knew it mattered. You carry him with you." Robert nodded, a small gesture, but his shoulders seemed to ease, as if a burden had shifted, if only slightly. Colonel James stepped forward, his dress uniform crisp, his medals glinting in the light. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "what unit were you with?" "2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines," Robert replied almost automatically. "India Company." The colonel's eyes narrowed, a spark of recognition. Quang Tri, 69, you were at the A Shao Valley? Robert gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. Yeah, that's where we lost him. A murmur rippled through the room, especially among the older veterans. The A Shao Valley was a name that carried weight, a place where the ground itself seemed to bleed. Colonel James turned to the crowd, his voice carrying now commanding attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a Marine here who fought in one of the bloodiest campaigns of Vietnam. A man who's kept a promise to a fallen brother for over 50 years. That's the kind of honor we're here to recognize today. He faced Robert, his hand rising in a slow, deliberate salute. Semper Fi, Marine. The words hit Robert like a wave, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Then, almost instinctively, his hand rose, returning the salute, his posture straightening, despite the ache in his joints. The room erupted in applause. Not loud, not showy, but steady, like a heartbeat. The young Marines at the table stood one by one, saluting in turn. Ethan was the last, his eyes locked on Robert's, a silent promise of his own. The volunteer who'd stopped Robert earlier, her clipboard now forgotten, approached, her face flushed. I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know. Robert shook his head, his smile faint but kind. No harm done, miss. You were just doing your job. But the moment wasn't over. Colonel James gestured to a table at the front, where a display of photos and artifacts from local veterans stood. Mr. Hayes, he said, would you allow us to add something of yours to the exhibit? That letter, maybe, or the dog tag you carry? Let David's story be part of this. Robert hesitated, his hand closing around the dog tag in his pocket. It was David's, the one he'd found in the mud after the blast. The one he'd carried every day since. Letting it go, even for a display, felt like losing him again. But he looked at the faces around him. The young Marines, the older veterans, the families watching with quiet respect. And something shifted. Maybe it was time to share David, to let others carry a piece of his memory. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, its metal warm from his hand. This was his, he said, holding it out to the colonel. If you'll make sure it's safe. Colonel James took it with both hands, like he was receiving a medal. It'll be honored, Marina, I promise. The crowd parted as the colonel carried the dog tag to the display, placing it beside a framed photo of a Vietnam-era platoon, not unlike the one Robert had left at the cemetery. A small card was added, handwritten, Lance Corporal David R. Mitchell, USMC, 1946 to 1969. Honored by Robert Hayes, India Company, 2nd 3rd Marines. The room watched in silence, the act carrying a weight that needed no explanation. As the event continued, Robert found himself surrounded, not overwhelmed, but gently included. A young Marine, barely out of high school, asked about Vietnam, her questions hesitant but earnest. An older veteran, his own medals pinned to a worn jacket, shared a story of his own from Desert Storm, his voice cracking with pride. Robert listened, nodded, spoke when he needed to, but mostly he felt the warmth of being seen, of being remembered. Ethan stayed close, his presence steady. You ever think about telling his story before? He asked as they stood by the coffee urn later. Robert shrugged, his eyes on the dog tag across the room. Didn't think anyone would listen. World's moved on, you know? Not everyone, Ethan said. I'm listening, and I'm not the only one. The event wound down, but the energy in the room had changed. People lingered, talking in small groups, their voices softer, their glances toward Robert carrying a new respect. The colonel announced that the VFW would start a new tradition, a yearly moment of silence on June 17th, for David Mitchell and all the fallen whose names lived on through promises kept. Robert heard it from across the room, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his lips. He didn't say anything, but his eyes shone, and he nodded once to himself. As he left the hall, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Willow Creek. The flags outside snapped in the breeze, their colors vivid against the fading light. Ethan walked him to his truck, carrying the empty cake tin Robert had brought from the cemetery. You need a ride next year? Ethan asked, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. I'll be there. At the cemetery, I mean. Robert looked at him, the young Marine who'd seen him when no one else had. "I'd like that," he said finally, "but bring your own bourbon." Ethan laughed, a sound that carried across the parking lot. "Deal." Robert climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life. As he drove home, the town seemed different, brighter somehow despite the dusk. He thought of David, of the promise he'd kept for 56 years, and for the first time, he felt it wasn't just his to carry anymore. The dog tag was in the VFW hall, but David's memory was spreading, taking root in the stories shared today, in the salute of a colonel, in the questions of a young Marine, in the quiet resolve of a kid like Ethan. Back in his apartment, Robert sat at the kitchen table, the second plastic cup still sitting where he'd left it that morning. He poured a small splash of bourbon, raised it to the empty air. "You're not forgotten, Mitch," he said, his voice steady now. "Not anymore." He drank, the burn of the bourbon sharp but comforting, and set the cup down. Outside, the town settled into night, the stars bright above the oaks. In the VFW hall, the dog tag gleamed under the display lights, a small piece of a larger story, one that would live on in Willow Creek, in the hearts of those who'd heard it, and in the quiet acts of kindness that would follow. The next morning, word of Robert's story had spread. The local paper ran a small piece, not on the front page, but tucked inside, where it mattered to those who read it. The diner downtown started a new tradition, a free slice of cake on June 17th for any veteran who stopped by. No questions asked. The cemetery saw more visitors that week, people leaving flowers not just for David, but for others whose stones had gone unnoticed for too long. Robert didn't know about most of it. He went about his days, quiet as always, but there was a change in him, a lightness in his step, a small smile when someone nodded to him on the street. Ethan stopped by a week later, bringing a thermos of coffee and a story about his own training, and they talked until the sun dipped low. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And so, a promise kept became a promise shared, rippling outward from a single grave to a town that remembered what it meant to honor its own. It wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but it was real. And in the end, that's what mattered. For more stories of quiet heroism and the power of small acts, subscribe to Hoffman Stories. Let's keep noticing the unnoticed together.